Victor hadn't shared a bed in 5 years. Women were a liability. They asked questions, expected affection, or worse, tried to find a pulse beneath his tailored suits. He preferred the quiet, solitary cold of his empty sheets. That was the rule. Unbreakable. Until a Tuesday night in December. He opened his bedroom door, shrugging off a leather holster, only to find a tangle of grey cotton and spilled brown hair on his mattress. His new maid was fast asleep. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private dining room, blurring the Chicago skyline into a smear of yellow and grey. Victor Russo sat at the head of the long mahogany table. He held a glass of scotch, though he wasn't drinking it. He just rolled the amber liquid around the heavy crystal, watching the single block of ice melt. Opposite him sat Leo Donati. The older man was sweating. "It's a simple arrangement," Victor Leo said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his anxious, twitching eyes. He gestured to the woman sitting rigidly beside him. She was young, beautiful in a manufactured way, poured into a red silk dress. "Isabella is loyal. She knows the life. A union between our families would solidify the northern ports. You need an heir. You need a wife." Victor finally looked up. His eyes were the color of wet slate, devoid of anything resembling warmth. He looked at Isabella. She swallowed hard, her manicured fingers trembling where they rested on her clutch. She terrified of him. Good. She should be. "I need silence, Leo," Victor said. His voice was low, gravelly, and barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the massive room like a gunshot. "And I need the 3 shipments of weapons you lost last month. A woman doesn't recoup $5 million. Victor, be reasonable." "I am." Victor set the glass down. The sharp clink made Isabella flinch. "I don't want your daughter. I don't want your alliances. I want my money by Friday. If I don't get it, I'm not coming back to a dinner table." He stood up, buttoning his charcoal suit jacket with practiced ease. He didn't look at the girl again. He walked out of the room, leaving the heavy scent of fear in his wake. Women were transactions to the men in his world, pawns to be traded dressed up and eventually discarded or mourned when the crossfire caught them. Victor had opted out of that game long ago. He preferred his massive echoing estate in the hills just outside the city. It was heavily guarded, wrapped in electric fencing and men with rifles, but inside it was entirely empty. Just the way he liked it. 30 miles away, Chloe Bennett was staring at a piece of paper that made her stomach turn over. It was a hospital bill. The numbers at the bottom were printed in bold black ink, but to Chloe they looked like a death sentence. $52,000. Tommy's kidney was failing faster than the doctors had predicted. Dialysis was eating up every cent she made, and her brother was fading into a bruised, exhausted ghost of the 15-year-old boy he used to be. Chloe folded the bill, her knuckles white, and shoved it into her coat pocket. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror of their cramped apartment. Dark circles bruised the skin under her brown eyes. Her skin was pale, her hair tied back in a messy, practical knot. She looked tired. She was 24, but she felt 50. She grabbed her keys. She didn't have time to be tired. An hour later, she was standing in the massive marble-floored foyer of the Russo estate, wearing a stiff grey uniform that smelled vaguely of industrial bleach. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, was a stern woman, with a face like a carved wooden mask. She paced in front of the line of 5 maids. "You do not speak unless spoken to." Mrs. Gable barked her heels, clicking sharply on the stone. "You do not make eye contact with Mr. Russo or his associates. You do not ask questions about what you see, what you hear, or what you clean up. Discretion is why you are paid triple the market rate. Break that rule, and you won't just lose your job." She let the threat hang in the cold air. Chloe stared straight ahead. She didn't care if Victor Russo was running a cartel, a cult, or a political campaign. She just needed the paycheck. "Bennett," Mrs. Gable snapped. "Yes, Ma'am." "You're on the East Wing today. Dusting, vacuuming, changing linens. Move." The East Wing was Victor's private sanctuary. The other maids shot Chloe looks of mingled pity and relief. The boss was notoriously particular. A stray hair on the sink, a smudge on the glass, it meant an instant firing. But Chloe just nodded, grabbing her caddy of supplies. She spent the next 6 hours in silent, grueling labor. The estate was a cavern of dark wood, leather, and steel. It felt more like a high-end bunker than a home. When she finally reached the master suite, the sheer scale of it made her pause. The bed alone was a massive California king, draped in heavy charcoal linens. The room smelled of cedar cold rain and a faint, sharp hint of expensive cologne. Chloe worked methodically. She stripped the bed, hauling the heavy mattress up to tuck the fresh sheets tightly beneath the corners. Her back ached. A dull throb started behind her temples. She ignored it. She pushed through the pain, thinking only of Tommy's pale face, the beep of the dialysis machine, the ticking clock of his life. She finished the room, leaving it spotless, sterile, and cold. Just a ghost moving through a dead house. She didn't know Victor Russo. She didn't want to. To her, he was just the signature on a very large, very necessary check. By mid-December, the Chicago winter turned brutal. A bitter freeze settled over the city, encasing the Russo estate in a thick shell of ice. It was a Tuesday. It was objectively the worst Tuesday of Chloe's life. She had woken up shivering in her freezing apartment, her throat feeling like it was lined with broken glass. A fever had set in, heavy and disorienting, wrapping her brain in a thick fog. But she couldn't call in sick. Mrs. Gable didn't accept sick days, and Tommy's medication was due for a refill on Friday. She swallowed 3 ibuprofen, wrapped herself in a scarf, and made the trek to the estate. The moment she stepped through the service doors, the heat of the mansion hit her like a physical blow, making her sway on her feet. "Bennett, East Wing." Again. Mrs. Gable ordered, barely glancing at her. "Mr. Russo is out dealing with business. He expects the suite deep cleaned upon his return." Chloe nodded blindly. She gathered her supplies and dragged herself up the grand staircase. Her joints screamed with every step. Her vision blurred at the edges. Meanwhile, across the city, Victor was dealing with a leak. The docks were freezing, the wind coming off Lake Michigan like a knife. Victor stood in the shadows of a shipping container, watching his men drag a bruised and bleeding warehouse manager to his knees. The man had been skimming from the shipments, selling Russo weapons to a rival crew. "Victor, please." The man begged, blood dripping from his split lip onto the frozen concrete. "I have a family. I have kids." Victor stared down at him. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel pity. He just felt a bone-deep, exhausting weariness. The same excuses, the same betrayals, the endless, cyclical violence of his life. "You should have thought of them before you stole from me," Victor said quietly. He didn't pull the trigger. He just nodded to his lieutenant, turned and walked back to his armored SUV. The muffled crack of a gunshot echoed behind him, swallowed instantly by the howling wind. Victor climbed into the back seat, leaning his head against the tinted glass. He closed his eyes. The headache he'd been fighting for 3 days was blinding. He just wanted a shower. He wanted a drink. He wanted the heavy, silent isolation of his bedroom. Back at the estate, Chloe was losing the battle against her body. She was in the master suite, trying to change the duvet cover. It felt like wrestling a parachute. The fever was spiking. Her skin was alternating between burning hot and freezing cold. She managed to get the cover on, smoothing it out over the mattress, but as she reached across the center of the bed, her knees gave out. She collapsed onto the mattress. Just a minute, she told herself, staring at the grey ceiling. Just give me 1 minute to catch my breath. The bed was impossibly soft. It smelled like cedar and safety. The exhaustion of working 2 jobs, the terror of losing her brother, the physical toll of the virus. It all crashed down on her at once. She curled onto her side, pulling her knees to her chest. She closed her eyes, intending to rest for exactly 60 seconds. The darkness pulled her under instantly. 4 hours later, the heavy oak door of the master suite clicked open. Victor stepped inside. He had shed his suit jacket in the foyer. He pulled at his tie, loosening it from his throat, and reached under his arm to unclip his shoulder holster. He was operating on pure muscle memory. Enter the room. Lock the door. Disarm. Sleep. He turned toward the bed. He froze. His hand dropped instantly to the heavy grip of his backup weapon at his waist. His eyes adjusted to the dim lighting. There was a lump beneath the charcoal duvet. Someone was in his bed. Victor moved silently, a predator slipping across the carpet. He drew the gun, clicking the safety off. He approached the side of the bed, his jaw tight, expecting an assassin, a setup, a nightmare. He reached out and yanked the heavy duvet back. Chloe let out a soft, shivering sigh, curling tighter into a ball. She was wearing her grey maid's uniform, her shoes kicked off near the nightstand. Her hair had escaped its bun, spilling across his pillows. Her face was flushed red with fever, her brow furrowed in a troubled sleep. Victor stood there, the gun aimed at the floor, perfectly still. He didn't yell. He didn't call his security team. He just stared. He recognized her vaguely. She was the one who had been cleaning his rooms lately. The quiet one who never looked up. He watched the steady, shallow rise and fall of her chest. She looked fragile. She looked completely, utterly defeated. A rational man would have woken her up. A ruthless boss would have dragged her out by her hair and thrown her into the snow for trespassing in his sanctuary. But Victor was too tired for violence, and the utter stillness of the room had shifted. It didn't feel like a vault anymore. It felt occupied. He slowly engaged the safety of his gun and set it on the nightstand. He looked at the door. He looked back at the girl. He walked around to the opposite side of the massive bed. He didn't take off his clothes. He just sat on the edge, toeing off his leather shoes. Then, moving deliberately, he lay down on his back on the far side of the mattress, leaving 3 feet of empty space between them. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of her breathing over the howl of the winter storm outside. For the first time in 5 years, Victor Russo closed his eyes and actually slept. Chloe woke up slowly, floating up from the heavy depths of a fever dream. Her body felt incredibly warm. For a second she thought she was back in her childhood bed, safe and oblivious. But then her senses began to boot up. The mattress beneath her was too firm, too expensive. The sheets were heavy cotton, not her cheap polyester blends, and the smell wood smoke, cedar and gunpowder. Her eyes snapped open. She was staring at a dark grey wall. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She remembered the fever, the duvet, lying down for just 1 second. Oh God, oh my God. She scrambled backward, tangling her legs in the thick blanket, trying to get out of the bed. Her heel hit something solid, something warm. Chloe froze. The blood drained from her face. She turned her head inch by agonizing inch. Lying next to her, propped up on one elbow, was Victor Russo. He was fully dressed in a wrinkled button-down shirt, his dark hair messy. He wasn't asleep. He was wide awake, watching her with a calm, unreadable expression. His eyes, sharp and grey, tracked her panic. Chloe stopped breathing. She was dead. She was actually going to die here, shot in the head, for sleeping in the mafia boss's bed. I'm sorry, she stammered, her voice a raspy whisper. She scrambled over the side of the bed, her stocking feet hitting the floor. She stumbled, her knees weak, and caught herself on the edge of the nightstand. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I was sick. I was so dizzy. I just sat down. I swear to God, Mr. Russo, I'll leave right now. You don't have to pay me for this week. I'll pack my things. She was hyperventilating, backing toward the door. Stop moving. Victor's voice wasn't loud, but it hit her like a physical wall. Chloe froze in her tracks. He sat up slowly, rolling his shoulders. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely indifferent, which somehow made it worse. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and looked down at her small, trembling frame. You have a fever, he stated. It wasn't a question. Yes, but I'm fine. I'm leaving. You were shaking half the night, Victor continued, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. You kept pulling the duvet. You drool, by the way. Chloe's face flushed a violent crimson. What? You drool? Victor stood up. He was a massive man, easily over 6 feet, broad-shouldered and imposing. The sheer presence of him in the room sucked all the oxygen out of the air. He walked over to a small wet bar in the corner of the room, picked up a glass, and poured some water from a pitcher. He walked back and held the glass out to her. Chloe just stared at it. Was it poisoned? Was this a trick? Take the water, Bennett. I'm not going to shoot you for taking a nap. Her hand trembled as she reached out and took the cold glass. Her fingers brushed his, and she flinched, but his skin was warm, his grip steady. She drank the water entirely because her throat felt like sandpaper, half expecting to drop dead on the carpet. Why didn't you wake me up? She asked softly, the question slipping out before her common sense could stop it. Why didn't you have me thrown out? Victor looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the dark bags under her eyes, the worn, frayed edges of her cheap uniform, the desperate, caged animal look in her brown eyes. She wasn't an assassin. She wasn't a spy. She was just a broken thing trying to survive. He recognized the look. He saw it in the mirror every morning. I was tired, Victor said simply. You were quiet. It seemed like too much effort. It was a lie. He had 6 men downstairs who would have removed her in 30 seconds. But Victor didn't want to examine why he had let her stay, why the sound of her breathing had anchored him in a way a sleeping pill never could. Get your shoes, he ordered, turning his back on her to open his closet. Go down to the kitchen. Tell Mrs. Gable to give you the day off. Paid. Chloe gaped at his back. She'll fire me. She won't, Victor said, his voice dropping back into that icy, authoritative timbre, because you're going to tell her that from now on, you are the only person permitted to clean this suite. No one else comes in here. Just you. Chloe scrambled into her shoes, her mind reeling. She survived. She kept her job. But as she hurried out the heavy oak door, glancing back one last time at the ruthless mafia boss standing in the center of the room, she realized a terrifying truth. She hadn't just kept her job. She had just become something Victor Russo noticed, and in his world that was infinitely more dangerous than being fired. Downstairs, the kitchen was a hive of morning activity. Mrs. Gable looked up from her clipboard as Chloe walked in, looking pale and disheveled. Where have you been, Bennett? You missed roll call. Chloe swallowed hard. Mr. Russo had me cleaning his suite. Mrs. Gable frowned, her eyes narrowing. All night? Yes, Chloe lied, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. He said I'm the only one allowed in the East Wing from now on. The kitchen went dead silent. The other maids stopped chopping, scrubbing and talking. They all stared at Chloe. Being requested by the boss wasn't a promotion. It was a target on your back. Upstairs, Victor stood by the window, watching the morning snow fall over the estate. He touched the side of the bed where she had slept. It was still slightly warm. He didn't know the girl's story, but for the first time in half a decade, Victor Russo found himself curious. And a curious monster is a very dangerous thing to be around. The isolation was immediate and absolute. Within 24 hours of Victor's order, Chloe became a pariah among the estate staff. Mrs. Gable didn't speak to her unless strictly necessary, and when she did, her words were clipped and laced with a cold, simmering suspicion. The other maids stopped talking when Chloe entered the break room. They gave her a wide berth in the hallways, their eyes darting to her face, searching for a bruised lip, a new necklace, or the smug entitlement of a boss's new mistress. They saw none of those things. Chloe just kept her head down, pushed her cart, and walked up the grand staircase to the east wing. The master suite had become her entire world. She learned the geography of Victor Russo's life through the things he left behind. Most days the room was immaculate, but slowly the sterile perfection began to crack. One Tuesday, she found a heavy crystal tumbler on the nightstand, half full of amber liquid smelling sharply of peat and smoke. She washed it and put it away. On Thursday, she found a custom-tailored charcoal suit jacket thrown carelessly over an armchair. The left cuff was stained with a dark, rusted brown. Blood. Chloe stood holding the jacket for a long time. Her heart did a slow, heavy thump against her ribs. She didn't call Mrs. Gable. She didn't run. She walked into the massive ensuite bathroom, retrieved a bottle of hydrogen peroxide from her cleaning caddy, and spent 20 minutes methodically dabbing the stain until the fabric was spotless. She hung the jacket back in his closet. She asked no questions. She left no notes. She just erased the violence. Victor noticed. He noticed the missing stain on his jacket. He noticed the way the heavy curtains were always drawn exactly to the edge of the window frame, blocking the glare of the morning sun from hitting his pillows. He noticed the absolute absence of a lingering perfume. Women he had known in the past always tried to leave a mark, a hairpin on the dresser, a scent in the air, a subtle claim of territory. Chloe left nothing. It was as if she passed through his room, like a phantom restoring order and vanishing before he could catch her. It grated on him. It fascinated him. He decided to test the boundary. He left a loaded Glock 19 on the center of his dark oak desk, right beside a ledger, detailing the routing numbers for offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. It was a deliberate, dangerous trap. Information that rival syndicates would pay millions to acquire. A weapon that could put him away for a decade. He returned that night at 2 a.m. He unlocked the door and stepped into the quiet chill of the suite. The room smelled faintly of lemon and clean cotton. He walked over to the desk. The surface had been polished to a mirror shine. The ledger was exactly where he had left it, perfectly aligned with the edge of the wood. The gun had been carefully placed on top of a folded dark grey microfiber cloth, presumably so the heavy metal wouldn't scratch the polish. Victor stared at the microfiber cloth. A short, rough sound escaped his throat. It took him a moment to realize it was a laugh. The sound felt foreign, jarring in the empty room. He didn't know if she was incredibly smart, incredibly stupid, or just entirely broken. But as he stripped off his tie and lay back on the mattress, the same mattress where she had slept perfectly curled on the opposite side just a week prior, he realized he was waiting for morning. He was waiting to see what she would do next. But the real world doesn't respect the quiet boundaries of a locked room. The intrusion came on a Friday. Chloe was vacuuming the thick rug beneath Victor's bed when her cell phone vibrated in her apron pocket. She ignored it. It buzzed again. And again. A frantic, continuous rattling. She shut off the vacuum. The silence of the room crashed in on her. She pulled the cheap cracked phone from her pocket and looked at the screen. St. Jude's Memorial. Her stomach plummeted into her shoes. She swiped the screen, her thumb trembling. "Hello?" Chloe Bennett. It was Dr. Hayes. He sounded tired. "It's Tommy." The room tilted. Chloe grabbed the edge of the heavy mattress to steady herself. "What happened? Did the dialysis fail?" His blood pressure bottomed out during treatment. "We managed to stabilize him, but the strain on his heart is severe." "Chloe, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. His kidneys are completely shut down. The standard dialysis isn't filtering the toxins fast enough anymore. He needs the continuous venovenous hemofiltration, and he needs to stay in the ICU." "Do it!" Chloe breathed, her voice cracking. "Please just do it." "I can't. Not without authorization from administration. Your insurance lapsed 3 days ago. The grace period is over. The hospital won't admit him to the ICU or begin the CVVH treatment without a deposit. They consider it out-of-network catastrophic care." "How much?" she asked. She already knew the answer would ruin her, but she had to hear the number. $60,000, Chloe, by tonight. Or I have to discharge him to a palliative care facility. Palliative care. A place to die comfortably. "I'll get it," Chloe said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "Give me until tonight. Please, Dr. Hayes, keep him in the bed. I will get the money." She hung up the phone. She didn't cry. There was no time to cry, and tears had never paid a single bill in her life. She looked around the cavernous, immaculate bedroom of Victor Russo. There was more money in the custom wool rugs and Italian leather chairs than she would make in a lifetime. She had no credit. She had no family. She had no options, except one. Victor arrived at the estate just past midnight. The drive from the docks had been tense. Leo Donati was pushing back. The missing shipments were a smoke screen. Donati was trying to rally the northern families to force Victor into a marriage alliance, hoping to dilute Victor's iron grip on the supply lines. Victor had spent 4 hours subtly threatening men twice his age. He was exhausted, his temper frayed to a thin, jagged wire. He wanted silence. He wanted his room. He bypassed his men in the foyer, walked up the stairs and pushed open the heavy door to his suite. He reached for the light switch. "Don't shoot." Victor's hand halted a fraction of an inch from the brass plate. His other hand was already inside his jacket, his fingers curled around the grip of his gun. He stood perfectly still, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. Chloe was sitting in the armchair in the corner of the room. She was wearing her grey uniform, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap, her knuckles glowed white in the moonlight spilling through the window. Victor slowly withdrew his hand from his jacket. He flipped the light switch. The sudden glare made her wince. "You're in my chair, Bennett," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of surprise, but there was a dangerous, quiet edge to it. "I know. I'm sorry." She didn't stand up. Her legs were shaking too badly. Victor walked to the wet bar. He poured 2 fingers of scotch, keeping his eyes on her reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. She looked worse than the day she had slept in his bed. Her skin was a sickly, translucent grey. The dark circles under her eyes looked like bruises. "You have 2 minutes to explain why you are sitting in the dark in my bedroom," Victor said, turning around to face her. He took a slow sip of the scotch. "Before I call my men to drag you out." "I need money," Chloe said. The words tumbled out of her mouth, blunt and desperate. Victor stared at her. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the room. He didn't laugh. He just looked at her with a profound, terrifying emptiness. "You broke into a mafia boss's private quarters," Victor said softly, pacing slowly toward her, "to ask for a loan." "Not a loan," Chloe said, her voice shaking but her chin lifting slightly. "An advance, or a trade, or whatever you want to call it. I need $60,000. Victor stopped a few feet from the chair. He looked down at her. "Do you have a gambling problem? Bennett, drugs? A boyfriend who owes the wrong people?" "My brother," she said, the crack in her voice betraying the steel she was trying to project. "He's 15. His kidneys are failing. He's at St. Jude's. The insurance cut off. And if I don't pay the hospital $60,000 by tomorrow morning, they are going to move him to hospice to die." Victor analyzed her face. He was an expert at reading lies. He searched for the micro-expressions of deception, the twitch of an eye, the forced swallow, the defensive posture. He found nothing, just raw, bleeding terror. He turned away from her, walking to his desk. He set his glass down on a coaster. "I am not a bank," Victor said to the wall. "I am not a charity. I am the man who controls the underground economy of this city. People who owe me money usually end up at the bottom of the lake. Why would you come to me?" "Because you didn't wake me up," Chloe whispered. Victor stiffened. "When I was sick." She continued, her voice trembling. "You could have thrown me out. You could have fired me. You didn't. You gave me a glass of water. It's the only kind thing anyone has done for me in 5 years. I don't have anyone else to ask." Victor turned around. He leaned against the heavy oak desk, crossing his arms. He looked at this tiny, fragile woman in her cheap uniform. She was nothing, a speck of dust in his violent world. He should write her a check, fire her, and be done with it. But Victor Russo didn't let go of things that intrigued him. $60,000 is a significant debt, Victor said quietly. "If I pay this, you don't work for Mrs. Gable anymore. You work for me. Directly. And not just cleaning." Chloe's breath hitched. Her mind raced to the darkest corners of what that meant. I don't want your body." Victor snapped a flash of irritation, breaking his cold veneer. "I have no interest in buying a woman. What I want is your time, your absolute loyalty. You will move into the staff quarters permanently. You will not leave this estate without my permission. You will be on call 24 hours a day for whatever I need done in this house. You will disappear from the outside world." He was offering her a cage, a gilded, secure cage. "For how long?" she asked. "Until the debt is paid," Victor replied. "At your current salary, minus living expenses, we'll call it 5 years. 5 years of her life, signed away to a monster in a tailored suit." But in her mind, she saw Tommy's pale face. She heard the steady beep of the heart monitor. "Do we have a deal?" Victor asked, his grey eyes boring into hers. Chloe stood up. Her legs finally held her. "Write the check." Victor pulled a heavy checkbook from his desk drawer. He wrote the numbers with sharp, aggressive strokes of his pen. He tore the check free and held it out. Chloe walked across the room. She reached for the paper. As her fingers clamped onto it, Victor didn't let go immediately. He held the tension, forcing her to look up at him. "You belong to me now, Bennett," he said softly, the weight of the reality settling over them both. "Do not ever lie to me. Do not ever betray me. Because the next time you wake up in my bed, I won't be handing you a glass of water." He let go of the check. Chloe clutched it to her chest, nodded once, and backed out of the room, fleeing into the dark hallway. Victor watched the door close. He picked up his scotch, downed it in one swallow, and welcomed the burn. 2 weeks passed. Tommy received the treatment. He stabilized. Chloe was allowed a 1-hour phone call with him every Sunday evening, monitored by one of Victor's security men standing outside the door of her new room in the staff wing. She had traded her freedom for her brother's life. She didn't regret it for a second. Her duties expanded. She was no longer just the maid for the East Wing. She managed Victor's personal schedule within the house, organized his meals with the private chef, and ensured his suits were pressed and ready. She became a silent, efficient shadow, anticipating his needs before he even articulated them. She learned that he drank his coffee black, that he read historical biographies at 3 a.m. when he couldn't sleep, and that he hated the smell of lavender. They barely spoke. They communicated through a dance of avoidance and quiet efficiency, until the first week of February. A blizzard had buried the estate under 3 feet of snow. The security perimeter was blinded by the whiteout. Chloe was in the kitchen at 1 a.m. boiling water for tea, enjoying the rare silence of the sleeping house. The heavy back door leading to the garage slammed open. A blast of freezing air and snow tore through the kitchen, scattering loose papers and knocking a plastic cup off the counter. Chloe dropped her mug. It shattered on the tile. Victor stood in the doorway. He was alone. He was heavily leaning against the doorframe, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His black overcoat was soaked, but not entirely from the snow. A dark, heavy liquid was dripping from his left sleeve, pooling onto the pristine white marble of the kitchen floor. Chloe froze. The air in her lungs vanished. Victor took a step forward, staggered and collapsed against the kitchen island. He gripped the granite countertop, his knuckles white, his head hanging down. "Mr. Russo!" Chloe gasped, rushing forward. "Don't call Dr. Evans!" Victor gritted out through clenched teeth. His face was the color of ash. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the freezing cold radiating off his clothes. "Evans is on Donati's payroll. I think. You need a hospital. You're bleeding." Chloe reached for his arm, but he violently flinched away. "No hospitals," he snarled, lifting his head. His eyes were wild, dilated with pain and adrenaline. "No one leaves. No one comes in. The leak is inside my crew." He tried to push himself off the counter to walk toward the stairs, but his legs gave out. He slid heavily to the floor, leaving a smear of red down the white cabinets. Chloe stood over him, panic warring with adrenaline. She had spent 5 years in and out of hospitals. She had watched doctors insert central lines, clean necrotic tissue, and stop hemorrhages. She wasn't a doctor, but she understood trauma better than most. She knelt beside him on the floor. "Take your coat off," she ordered. Her voice was surprisingly steady. Victor looked at her, his eyes struggling to focus. "What?" "Take the coat off, Victor. If you pass out before I can get to the wound, you'll bleed to death on this floor." She used his first name without thinking. It felt like breaking glass. He didn't argue. He gritted his teeth and let her help him peel the heavy sodden wool coat off his shoulders. The smell of copper hit the air thick and metallic. Beneath the coat, his white dress shirt was ruined. A deep, jagged slash ran across his left bicep, slicing cleanly through the fabric and deep into the muscle. It wasn't a bullet wound, it was a knife, a close-quarters fight. "I need towels, boiling water, and the first aid kit from your bathroom," she said, talking to herself as much as to him. Third drawer, left side. Victor mumbled, his head thumping back against the lower cabinets. Chloe ran. She sprinted up the stairs, ignoring the burning in her lungs, grabbed the massive medical kit Victor kept in his master bath, and raced back down. When she returned, Victor's eyes were closed. His breathing was dangerously shallow. "Hey!" she snapped, dropping to her knees and slapping his cheek lightly. Look at me. Keep your eyes open." His eyes fluttered open. The slate grey was clouded with pain. Chloe ripped the sleeve of his shirt open, exposing the wound. It was ugly, deep and jagged, but it hadn't hit the main artery, or he would already be dead. She poured iodine directly onto the laceration. Victor let out a guttural roar, his body arching off the floor. His right hand snapped out, wrapping around Chloe's throat in a blindingly fast, instinctive reaction of self-defense. His grip was like a vice, cutting off her air instantly. Chloe didn't scream. She didn't fight him. She placed her small, warm hands over his massive, blood-stained fist, holding her throat. She looked directly into his eyes, refusing to break contact. "It's just me," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely squeezing through her restricted windpipe. "It's just me. Let go." Victor stared at her. The violence slowly drained from his eyes, replaced by a dawning horror at what he was doing. His hand jerked away from her throat as if her skin burned him. "I'm sorry," he rasped, his chest heaving. "I'm sorry." "I know," she said quietly, rubbing her neck. She picked up a heavy gauze pad and pressed it violently against the wound. "Hold this. Don't let up the pressure." Victor clamped his right hand over the gauze. He watched her as she moved. Her hands were completely steady. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. She was terrifyingly calm, bathed in his blood on a kitchen floor at 2 a.m. "You need stitches," she said, threading a curved surgical needle with rapid precision. "I've watched the nurses do this on Tommy's port lines. It's going to hurt. A lot." "Do it," Victor said. She leaned in close. He could feel the warmth of her breath against his cold skin. He could smell the faint scent of lemon soap on her hands, mixed with the harsh chemical burn of iodine and blood. Every time she pushed the needle through his skin, his muscles jumped, but he didn't make a sound. He just watched her face, the intense concentration furrowing her brow, the slight purse of her lips. For a man who had spent his entire life avoiding trust, placing his survival entirely in the hands of a maid he had bought 2 weeks ago, felt entirely unnatural. Yet as she tied off the final stitch and sat back on her heels, swiping a streak of his blood off her own forehead, Victor realized something undeniable. He didn't want anyone else in the room. He didn't want his guards. He didn't want a doctor. He only wanted her. The kitchen was spotless by dawn. Chloe had spent 2 hours on her hands and knees with bleach, a wire brush, and a bucket of scalding water scrubbing until the white marble gave up its secrets. When the morning staff arrived, they found nothing but the faint, sterile smell of chemicals. Victor was already in his office. He sat behind his massive desk, dressed in a fresh charcoal suit. He looked perfectly composed. No one looking at him would know a jagged 6-inch ravine was currently stitched into his left arm, throbbing with a dull, sickening heat. The heavy mahogany doors clicked open. Chloe stepped inside, carrying a silver tray with a single cup of black coffee. She didn't announce herself. She walked to the desk, set the tray down, and then, without a word, reached out and locked the office doors from the inside. Victor watched her, his grey eyes tracking every movement. "Take the jacket off," she said. Her tone wasn't a request. "I have a meeting with the capos in 20 minutes," Victor replied, though he didn't move to stop her as she walked around the desk. "Then you have 19 minutes to let me check for an infection." He sighed a short, clipped sound and shrugged off the jacket. He unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt and let her pull the left sleeve up over his shoulder. The bruising had already set in, blooming into a violent mosaic of purple and black across his bicep. Chloe carefully peeled back the heavy gauze. The stitches held tight. No red streaks. No excessive heat. "It's clean," she murmured. She reached into her apron, pulled out a fresh tube of antibiotic ointment, and applied it with infuriating gentleness. Victor looked down at the top of her head. He could see the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders. She was surviving on caffeine and sheer, stubborn willpower. "You didn't sleep," he stated. "Neither did you." She taped down a fresh square of gauze. "I don't like blood. I didn't want to close my eyes and see it on the floor again. In my line of work, you get used to it." Chloe paused, her hands resting on his arm for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "I don't want to get used to it. If you get used to seeing blood, it means you've stopped caring whose it is." She pulled his sleeve back down and turned to grab the dirty bandages. "Wait," Victor said. He opened the top drawer of his desk. The heavy slide of the metal drawer echoed in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a compact black piece of metal, a Smith & Wesson M&P shield. He placed it flat on the leather blotter between them. Chloe stared at it like it was a live rattlesnake. The leak last night wasn't just a low-level earner. Victor said, his voice dropping in volume, forcing her to lean in to hear him. "Donati bought someone close to me. Someone on my personal detail. I don't know who it is yet, which means I don't trust anyone in this house." He pushed the gun across the desk until it bumped against the silver coffee tray. "Except you?" Chloe took a step back, shaking her head. "I don't know how to use that. I've never even held one. It has a safety on the trigger, not a switch. You point it, you pull it. The recoil will snap your wrists back if you don't lock your elbows, but at close range, it won't matter." Victor stood up. He walked around the desk, picked up the weapon, and held it out to her by the barrel. "Take it, Bennett. I'm a maid," she whispered, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "You're the only person who knows I'm bleeding. That makes you a liability to my enemies and an asset to me." He stepped closer, the scent of cedar and gunpowder wrapped around her. "I can't protect you if I'm looking over my shoulder at my own men. Put it in your apron." Chloe looked into his eyes. There was no warmth there, but there was a terrifying, absolute sincerity. She reached out with a trembling hand and took the gun. It was heavier than it looked. Dense. Cold. She slipped it into the deep front pocket of her apron. It weighed her down, a physical anchor, pulling her deeper into his dark, suffocating world. "Good," Victor said quietly. "Now go change my bed linens." The shift in their dynamic was subtle, but unbreakable. They were no longer boss and employee. They were co-conspirators in a house full of traitors. Over the next 3 days, the tension in the estate thickened until it was hard to breathe. The capos came and went, their faces grim. Shouting matches echoed from behind the closed doors of the dining room. Leo Donati was making his play for the Northern Territories, using Victor's missing weapons as proof of incompetence. Chloe stayed out of the way, but she kept the gun in her pocket. On Thursday night, the blizzard returned. The wind battered the massive glass windows of the estate, howling like a dying animal. Chloe was in her room in the staff wing, sitting on her narrow twin bed, staring at a photograph of Tommy on her cracked phone. He looked better. The color was returning to his cheeks. The debt was worth it. She told herself that every hour. At 11:42 p.m. the power went out. The estate plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. Chloe froze. She waited for the low hum of the massive backup generators to kick in. 5 seconds passed. 10. 20. Nothing. The house remained dead. The silence was shattered by a sound she had never heard before, but instantly recognized from movies. A sharp, mechanical thwack, like a heavy staple gun driving into wood. It came from the west corridor. Then came the screaming. Panic clawed at Chloe's throat. She stood up in the pitch black, her hands frantically patting the dark, to find the apron she had draped over her chair. She grabbed the heavy fabric, digging her hand into the pocket until her fingers curled around the cold grip of the Smith & Wesson. The door to her room suddenly splintered inward with a deafening crash. Chloe screamed, dropping to her knees and leveling the gun at the doorway with shaking, untrained hands. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, hitting her directly in the eyes, blinding her. "Put it down. It's me." The beam shifted toward the floor. Victor stood in the shattered doorway. He was wearing black cargo pants and a dark, long-sleeve shirt, holding a customized rifle in his right hand. His face was a mask of cold, calculated murder. "Donati!" Chloe gasped, scrambling to her feet. "He bought the night shift captain," Victor said, his voice flat. He stepped into the room, grabbing her by the bicep and pulling her into the hallway. "They cut the hard lines and spiked the generators. We have maybe 4 minutes before they clear the ground floor and move up." "Where are your men?" "Dead. Or getting there." Victor pushed her gently down the hallway. "Stay behind me. Step where I step. Don't make a sound." They moved through the sprawling, dark corridors of the staff wing. The estate felt entirely alien in the blackness. The air smelled like cordite and drywall dust. Downstairs, the sharp, suppressed cracks of gunfire continued, followed by the heavy thuds of bodies hitting the hardwood. "We need to get to the master suite," Victor whispered, pausing at the top of the grand staircase. "The walls are reinforced with half-inch steel plate. The door is biometric and mechanical. If we get inside, they can't breach it without C4, and Donati's men aren't carrying explosives. They want the house intact." Chloe nodded, gripping her small gun so tightly her hand cramped. They moved out onto the mezzanine. Below them, the massive foyer was illuminated by the sweeping beams of 3 flashlights attached to the barrels of tactical rifles. Men in dark tactical gear were moving systematically from room to room. Victor raised his rifle, resting the barrel on the marble balustrade. "Run for the suite," he whispered, not looking at her. "I'll cover you." "I'm not leaving you," she hissed. "Chloe, move," he barked, shedding the quiet facade. One of the flashlights downstairs snapped upward, the beam catching them on the mezzanine. "Top floor, east wing," a voice yelled. Victor squeezed his trigger. The rifle roared, a deafening explosion of sound and muzzle flash that temporarily blinded Chloe. The man with the flashlight collapsed backward into the foyer, his chest cratered. The return fire was instantaneous. Bullets chewed into the marble balustrade, sending razor-sharp shards of stone flying into the air. Chloe hit the deck, covering her head as the deafening barrage echoed off the high ceilings. "Crawl!" Victor shouted, over the noise firing short, controlled bursts down into the dark. Chloe scrambled on her hands and knees down the hallway toward the east wing. The distance felt like miles. Her knees scraped against the carpet, tearing her skin. She could hear the heavy boots of Donati's men pounding up the grand staircase. Victor was backing up, providing covering fire, but his left arm was slowing him down. The stitches were tearing under the strain of holding the heavy rifle. Chloe could see the fresh, dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his shirt. She reached the heavy oak door of the master suite. She pressed her hand flat against the scanner. Nothing happened. The power was out. "Victor, it won't open!" she screamed. Victor slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle. "Under the scanner. There's a panel. Slide it up. It needs a physical key." He tossed a heavy brass key down the hall. It skittered across the carpet, stopping 3 feet from her. A tactical operative rounded the corner at the end of the hall. He raised a shotgun, aiming squarely at Victor's back. Time slowed down to a cruel, agonizing crawl. Victor was turning, but he wouldn't be fast enough. His left arm was failing. The man's finger was tightening on the trigger. Chloe didn't think. She didn't weigh the moral consequences of taking a life. She just saw the man who had bought her brother's heartbeat, about to lose his own. She raised the Smith and Wesson locked her elbows just like he had told her and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed her wrists back, sending a shockwave up her arms. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed hallway. The operative lurched sideways, the shotgun blasting a hole into the ceiling as he collapsed against the wall, clutching a shattered collarbone. Victor didn't hesitate. He finished the man off with 2 rounds to the chest, grabbed the brass key from the floor, shoved it into the hidden panel, and wrenched the heavy door open. He grabbed Chloe by the collar of her shirt and hauled her inside, slamming the steel-reinforced door shut and throwing the 3 heavy deadbolts just as a hail of bullets impacted the wood on the other side. The door held. Inside the pitch-black suite, the silence was immediate and deafening, broken only by their ragged, desperate breathing. Chloe dropped the gun. It hit the carpet with a dull thud. Her hands were shaking so violently she couldn't feel her fingers. She backed away until her spine hit the wall, sliding down into a crouch. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in her arms. She couldn't breathe. The smell of the gunpowder was making her sick. Victor dropped his rifle on the bed. He walked over to her in the dark. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her it was okay, because it wasn't. He knelt in front of her, reached out, and wrapped his large, warm hands over hers to stop the shaking. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. Chloe lifted her head. Tears were streaming down her face, cutting tracks through the plaster dust. "You saved my life," Victor said. "I shot him," she choked out. "I actually shot him. You did what you had to do to survive. Do not apologize for surviving, Chloe. Ever." He leaned in closer, his forehead resting lightly against hers. The heat of his skin was an anchor in the freezing dark. "Carmine is 5 minutes out with 40 men. The steel will hold until then. It's over." They sat on the floor of the dark suite, his hands covering hers, waiting for the cavalry. And for the first time in his violently solitary life, Victor realized the fortress he had built wasn't designed to keep the world out. It had been waiting for someone worth locking inside. By 6 a.m. the estate was secure. The snow had stopped, leaving the grounds blanketed in a pristine, blinding white that hid the violence of the night. Carmine and his crew had arrived like a sledgehammer, clearing Donati's men from the property with ruthless efficiency. Leo Donati himself had been found cowering in a black SUV at the edge of the property line. Victor hadn't bothered to go down and look at him. He simply gave Carmine a nod, and Leo Donati ceased to be a problem. Power was restored. The hum of the estate's heating system kicked back on. Chloe was sitting on the edge of the massive bed in the master suite. She had washed the plaster and dust off her face in the ensuite bathroom, but her eyes were still hollow. The adrenaline had crashed, leaving her bones feeling like lead. Victor walked out of the walk-in closet. He had changed his shirt and rebandaged his arm himself. He looked exhausted, the lines around his mouth deeply carved. He walked over to his desk, the same desk where she had begged him for $60,000 3 weeks ago. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a heavy leather-bound ledger. He flipped to a page halfway through the book. He stared at it for a long moment, then reached for a heavy silver lighter he kept next to his Scotch glasses. He flicked the lighter open. The flame hissed. He held the edge of the page to the fire. Chloe watched, bewildered, as the thick paper curled and blackened, turning to ash that fluttered onto the polished wood. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Erasing the ledger," Victor said. He dropped the burning remnants of the page into an empty crystal ashtray, watching the final embers die out. He closed the book and looked at her. "Your debt is paid. The 60,000 is cleared." Chloe stood up. Her legs were shaky, but she forced herself to stand tall. "We agreed to 5 years. It hasn't been a month. You took a bullet for me, Bennett. Figuratively and literally. The contract is void." Victor gripped the edge of the desk. He refused to look at her now. He stared at the wall above her head. "I've already transferred $2 million into a trust under Tommy's name. It will cover his medical bills, his college, his life. Carmine is waiting downstairs. He's going to drive you to the hospital. You can pack your things." Chloe didn't move. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating. He was sending her away. The cage door was open. She had everything she had ever wanted, her brother's safety and her freedom. "Why?" she asked quietly. Victor finally looked at her. The icy, controlled facade cracked, revealing the raw, bleeding man underneath. "Because look at you. You have blood on your hands. You have gunpowder in your hair. I drag everything I touch down into the dirt, Chloe. I don't want to see you become a ghost in this house. Take the money and get out before I change my mind." It was an order. It was the absolute command of a mafia boss. Chloe walked across the room. She didn't stop until she was standing inches from him. She looked up into his slate-grey eyes, seeing the fear he was trying so desperately to hide. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of ruining her. "Don't you ever decide what I can handle," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, steady whisper. Victor's jaw tightened. "Chloe, I was ruined before I met you," she interrupted. "I was watching my brother die, counting pennies to see if we could afford heat. That was hell. This—" She gestured to the bullet-scarred door of the suite. "This is just noise." She reached out, placing her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. It was beating fast, a hard, erratic rhythm beneath the expensive cotton of his shirt. "I slept in your bed," Chloe said softly, the memory of that first, terrifying night hanging between them. "And you didn't throw me out. You gave me a glass of water. You let me stay when you had every reason to destroy me. So I'm not leaving, unless you tell me you don't want me here. If you tell me that I'll walk out that door right now." Victor looked down at her. He saw the fierce, unyielding light in her brown eyes. She wasn't a maid anymore. She wasn't a hostage to a medical bill. She was an equal, a partner who had walked through the fire and chosen to stay in the ashes. He brought his right hand up, threading his fingers into her messy, dust-covered hair. He gripped the back of her neck, pulling her in until there was no space left between them. When he kissed her, it wasn't gentle. It was desperate, rough, and deeply human. It tasted like ash salt and the promise of a future they both had to fight for. Chloe kissed him back, wrapping her arms around his waist, anchoring herself to the monster who had become her salvation. Hours later, the sun broke through the grey winter clouds, casting long shafts of light across the ruined estate. Inside the master suite, the heavy curtains were drawn, plunging the room into a quiet, comforting twilight. The estate was silent. The war was over, at least for today. On the massive California king bed, Victor Russo was fast asleep. He lay on his back, the heavy charcoal duvet pulled up to his waist. Beside him, curled tightly against his side, Chloe rested her head on his uninjured shoulder. One of his large hands was resting protectively on her hip, anchoring her to him, even in sleep. There was no empty space between them anymore. The fortress was finally a home. That brings us to the end of Victor and Chloe's intense, blood-stained journey from a terrifying accident to an unbreakable bond. Did you expect Chloe to pull the trigger when it mattered most? Or did Victor's ultimate sacrifice catch you off guard? Let me know your favorite part of this gritty romance in the comments below. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, do me a massive favor. Smash that like button, share this video with your fellow drama lovers, and hit subscribe so you never miss another deep, dark romance. See you in the next one.